Welcome to our third session together. Let's remind ourselves where we are in the story. So we'll back up and just hit the last minute of last week. There was a famine throughout Europe. This is going to be a fun night. There was a famine throughout Egypt, and Joseph, one of the sons of Jacob, managed the food well and saved the nation of Egypt. This made him very popular with Pharaoh, who told Joseph to move his family to Egypt in order to avoid further famine. And Pharaoh basically said, bring your father and all the family down to Egypt, and we'll settle them in good, fertile land. This is the land of Goshen. This would be Jacob and all of his descendants, so all 12 sons and their families. These are the 12 tribes of Israel, the Israelites. One of the tribes was in Egypt. That was Joseph. So there's only moving 11 of them, but you get my point. That was the end of Genesis. And tonight we're going to be looking at the books of Exodus, Numbers, and Joshua. We're going to touch on Deuteronomy real quick, but we're going to be going through those books. And a lot of time passes between the end of Genesis and the beginning of the next book, which is Exodus. 400 years pass between the end of one book and the beginning of the next. So there's a 400-year gap. And when Jacob and his family moved down to Egypt, there were only 70 people in the whole family. But now there are millions of them. 400 years later, that's a lot of generations, and 70 people turn into millions. The old Pharaoh, 400 years ago, he cared for them because he liked Joseph. He was appreciative of what Joseph had done. But the new Pharaoh, 400 years later, has no close relationship with the Israelites. And the Israelites have now become slaves in Egypt. They cry out to God for help. God hears them, and God is going to rescue them. But the Israelites aren't quite the people who originally moved down to Egypt. Over the many, many generations that have taken place, that have happened, they've grown accustomed to the Egyptian way of life, to their customs, and in addition to the one true God, they're now worshiping the false Egyptian gods. This is going to be a problem. Now, Pharaoh feels threatened by the massive numbers of the Israelites. He's worried that they might align themselves with a foreign power, and between the two of them, they'll be able to overthrow Egypt. So Pharaoh wants to try and limit the power of the Israelites. And he does this by sending out an edict to the Israelite midwives, and he commands them that when a child is delivered, if it's a boy, kill it. If it's a daughter, let it live. The midwives come up with a very clever excuse around this, so they don't comply. But then he changes the edict and says, if a male child is born, you have to cast it into the Nile and kill it that way. Pharaoh is trying to kill all the males of Israel. And this is the nation that God considers his firstborn. So it's personal. This is going to come up later. Shortly thereafter, one of these infants is cast into the Nile, but he's cast into the Nile in a basket. So sort of like an ark. And he is saved. One of Pharaoh's daughter sees the baby and draws it out of the Nile, and this is who we know as Moses. Moses is raised in Pharaoh's household, and he's raised in Pharaoh's household. I'm getting confused. He's raised in Pharaoh's household. They know he's an Israelite, but he's raised in Pharaoh's household. When he's an adult, he comes upon a scene where an Egyptian is beating an Israelite, and he ends up killing the Egyptian. And then he flees for his life, because if Pharaoh gets a hold of him, he's going to kill him. So Moses ends up in the land of Midian, and he gets married, he has a son, and he becomes a shepherd. Moses is drawn out of the Nile. I'm forgetting my clicks already. So one day, Moses is drawn towards Mount Horeb, and he goes up and he sees a burning bush. The burning bush intrigues him because the bush is burning, but it's not being consumed. And so he's sort of sits there and watches for a while, and then God calls out to him, and they start a conversation. This is the Bible's first theophany, that word that's up there. A theophany is a manifestation of God. So it's some sort of physical manifestation of God in the world. For those of you who like trivia, the word theophany, a manifestation of God in the world, is where we get the name Tiffany from. Theophany, Tiffany. So if you guys happen to know someone named Tiffany, they're a manifestation of God in the world. You may not think of them that way. I know a Tiffany, and she definitely is. So I'll leave that to whoever you know. So God begins a conversation with Moses in which God reveals his name. He says, I am who I am. That's God's name. Represents the eternity, the eternal nature of God. In the ancient world, knowing the name was sort of like having a password today. It gave you access. So it's a very special thing that took place. And then God calls Moses to a mission. And, God calls Moses to a mission. He says, come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring forth my people, the sons of Israel out of Egypt. Now, Moses feels inadequate for the mission. He doesn't feel that he speaks well, and he tries to get out of it. He says to God, who am I to do this? And God replies, I'll be with you. I'll be with you. Whenever God, in the Bible, whenever God gives someone a mission, he always tells them, I'll be with you. And this directly connects to something that I really love in the Catholic Mass. 3 or 4 times during the Mass, each Mass, we are told by the priest or by the deacon, the Lord be with you. And with your spirit, right? Knowing our response, oh, that's important. But receiving that blessing and not casting it aside as some casual comment is really important. The Lord is telling you through the priest, through the deacon, that he'll be with you. If you feel you've got a mission in life, if you feel you've got challenges in your life, God's saying, I'll be with you. And he's reminding you of that several times every single Mass. So don't let it go by. That's the Lord be with you at the end, which I clicked forward and then I had to come back and on. So at this point, Moses takes his brother Aaron and goes and talks to Pharaoh. They initially say, we all think they say, let my people go, right? Let them go. But what they initially say is, let the people go out into the wilderness for a few days and worship properly, and then they'll come back. And Pharaoh says no. In fact, he says no, and then he increases the workload dramatically on the people, rather cruelly. And this kind of upsets God. And God now escalates the demand to permanent liberation. Now is when he's saying, let my people go, permanently. And the plagues begin in order to try and force Pharaoh's hands. Now, each time before a plague starts, God will send Moses to warn Pharaoh and say, come on, do it now. And Pharaoh says no, and then the plague takes place. And these plagues are all sorts of things, from turning the Nile red with blood to frogs, gnats, flies, locusts, disease, darkness, all sorts of different things, 10 of them in all. And God is able to turn them on and off at will. And still, Pharaoh refuses. Then comes the 10th and final plague. And this is the plague of the death of the firstborn across all of Egypt, including the Pharaoh's son. See, Pharaoh is offending and hurting the firstborn of God, and God's final plague is to threaten the death of the firstborn across Egypt. But Pharaoh still refuses. So this leads us into the Passover. The preparation for this plague brings us to the Passover. And the Passover is the central redemptive event in the entire Old Testament. Everything either feeds into this event or springs from this event. It can't be overstated. Before God initiates this 10th plague, he instructs Moses to go tell the people, go tell the Israelites how to protect themselves from from what's coming up. And this is where we get the Passover from. There's a kind of a formula, it's something that you have to follow. First, they have to procure a lamb. They have to get a lamb on the 10th of Nisan. Nisan is one of their months. So procure a lamb on the 10th day of the month of Nisan. inspect it to make sure that it has no blemishes, that it's got to be a perfect sacrifice, and then set it apart from the flock. Anytime you set something apart for a divine purpose, you make it holy. So the process of setting it apart from the flock makes the sacrifice holy. And then they're supposed to watch over it for 4 days, and then on the 14th day of Nisan, they sacrifice the lamb. And then they take the blood of the lamb and they spread it on the doorposts and lintels of the house. So sort of like the door jamb of the front of their house. Now, when the angel of death passes over Egypt, the angel of death will, there we go, spread it. So when the angel of death passes over Egypt, the angel of death will see that your doorway is marked with the blood of the lamb, and the angel of death will pass over your house, which is where you get the name Passover from. So, in addition to this, they're told to roast the lamb and eat of the flesh of the lamb. They must eat with their staff in hand and as if they're in flight, as if they're ready to leave, because in fact they are in this case. And they're also told to have their loins girt. Have you ever heard the phrase girding your loins? Has anybody wondered what that actually means? How many of you actually know what that means? Because it's a very uncommon thing. Huh? Sort of at the rodeo? No, this is Israelites. I don't think it has anything to do with the rodeo. I could be wrong. You might. Okay. So just to make sure we're on the same page. Back then, they all wore, sort of like long robe kind of thingies. And it's really hard to run in a long robe kind of thingy. So to gird your loins meant to gather the skirt thingy up, sort of tie it up around between your legs and tuck it into your waistband so that now all of that fabric is up above your knees. So if you needed to, you could run. That's what girding your loins means. You can all thank me later when somebody asks you the next time. So they're told to eat with their staff in their hand as if they're ready to go and have your loins girt. Be ready to run. I have no idea if that means anything with the rodeo. We'll talk afterward. So God also instructs them to explain, to make sure that the children understand what's going on. Make sure the children understand and observe the Passover every year. This is meant to be now a perpetual thing that's going to happen forever throughout the generations. For them, they're told to remember this night. And that doesn't mean just to simply call it to mind, but to bring it present today. Every Passover, they're meant to bring it present as if it's happening again. And they're supposed to be staff in hand, loins girt, ready to take flight. In the present day, we do the same thing at Mass. When we hear the priest repeat the words of Jesus, "Do this in memory of me," we're not supposed to just remember the Lord's Supper. We're supposed to be part of the process of bringing it present at every Mass. That's what it means to do this in remembrance of me, to do this in memory of me. So we make it present during Mass. The Last Supper is the fulfillment of the Passover. That's what the Last Supper is. The Passover freed the people from physical slavery. But the Last Supper institutes the Eucharist. The Last Supper and Christ's death and resurrection deliver us from spiritual slavery, not just physical slavery. So it frees us from spiritual slavery and from our sin. Now, at this point, I'm going to go off a little bit because I heard a little piece of trivia from Father Mike Schmitz one time, and I found it very interesting. I'm going to pass it along because my personality is that if I know a piece of trivia, I have to share it. For instance, girding your loins. So, Father Mike Schmitz described this one time, and it stuck with me. Names are very important to these people. If you've been paying attention during session 1 and session 2, all of the names meant something, right? Isaac was laughter, and Jacob was usurper, and all this kind of stuff. So the names meant something. And it wasn't just something trivial. It was sort of like connected to them. So their name was connected to them in some way. And it was sort of like who they are. In fact, they had a custom amongst themselves that when you die, you don't really die. As long as someone's repeating your name on some sort of regular basis, you're still alive. So for that reason, they want to keep their name alive. They want to keep their name in circulation, so to speak. So for that reason, they wanted their names to be permanent. Therefore, what they would do, they would carve their name into the doorposts of their house. And in Egypt, not Europe, in Egypt, the doorposts and lintel of the house were made out of stone. Very often this was the most permanent part of the house. So that's what they chose to etch their name into. So they would etch their name, and all of the family members would have their name. Perhaps for generations, all of these names would be there. And as long as somebody saw the name and remembered them, they would still be alive. So that's what they did. Now, connect that with the fact that the Passover says to spread the blood of the lamb over the doorposts and lintels of the house. So what's going to happen to those names that are etched into the doorpost? They're going to get washed in the blood of the lamb. So if you've ever heard of being washed in the blood of the lamb, so thank you, Father Mike Schmitz. If there's anything wrong with that, you can talk to him because I got it from him. But I thought it was interesting. So after the 10th plague, after Pharaoh loses his firstborn son, he finally gives in and tells them, leave, get out of here, go. And then about 2 days later, he changes his mind and decides to pursue them. So they've got a 2 or 3 day head start. And Pharaoh grabs his army and all of his chariots, and they go after him. And they catch up with him at about the Red Sea, just before the Red Sea. And you probably know the story. I won't get into it in a whole bunch of detail. God tells Moses to raise your arms, and wind blows over the Red Sea and parts the Red Sea, and the Israelites are able to walk across to the other side on dry ground. Pharaoh, who is just hell-bent on revenge, sends his armies in after him. And as the chariots get in there, God tells Moses, okay, collapse the water, and they collapse the water, and the entire Egyptian army is destroyed in front of the Israelites. So God's taking care of them, to say the least. So, but now there's a new problem. The Israelites number about 2 to 3 million people, and there's no food in the desert. Now, certainly they brought some with them, but it's running out. At this time, it's about 45 days after they've left Egypt, and they're running out of food. So what's the right thing to do? You've got God. You've watched all this miraculous stuff happen. You pray to God for food. But that's not what they do. They don't pray respectfully to God for food. Instead, they complain. And they complain a lot all throughout Exodus. It's just amazing. Like every other page is them complaining about something. They were freed from slavery. They had God leading the way physically as a pillar of fire or a cloud. They watched as God told Moses to part the Red Sea. They went across. They watched their enemies drown in the Red Sea. All of this provision, and still they're complaining, which is amazing. The Bible says this. It says, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. They said this, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt, but you have brought us out here into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Ungrateful, very ungrateful. But the Lord wanted to provide for his firstborn son. And the Lord says to Moses, I am going to rain down bread from heaven for you. This is the manna. God provides for his people. Now, what would happen was overnight, bread would appear on the ground, and then they were told to gather it up. And they were told to gather up what they needed for that day. And if they tried to gather up too much and try and keep it for the next day, anything they tried to keep would spoil overnight. They wouldn't be able to do that. So they could only gather up what they needed for that day, except on the day before the Sabbath, because they weren't allowed to gather on the Sabbath because that was work. So on the day before the Sabbath, they were told to gather up 2 days. And somehow, on that day, it wouldn't spoil overnight. They would have a different expiration date on that particular day, which was absolutely amazing. So they had never seen this before. They'd never seen anything like this on the ground before. They had never seen this exploration kind of stuff going on. But importantly, they had never seen this on the ground before. And they were desert-dwelling people. So, and the very fact that they had never seen it before is how we get the name manna. In Hebrew, manna means, what is it? So they're looking at this going, we've never seen this before. Manna, what is it? And it's stuck. So it's now the what is it from heaven is what it is all these 3,500 years later or something like that. So God has provided miraculous food for them to eat to sustain their natural lives as they go through the desert. Now, the manna is a type. A type in the Bible is a hint or a prefigurement of something that Jesus is going to elevate and fulfill in the New Testament. So the manna is a hint at what's to come. And Jesus is going to elevate this manna in the New Testament and institute the Eucharist. So the manna turns into the Eucharist in the New Testament. This is miraculous food, but in this case, not just to sustain our natural lives, but to give us eternal life. Now, when I first came to faith about 12, 13 years ago, one of the things that I wrestled with as I realized I was coming to faith was whether or not I was going to be Catholic. I didn't know if I got to the point where I believed in God, am I going to be Catholic or not? And the deciding point for me was whether or not the Eucharist was true. So Eucharist was true. Slow down, Greg. Eucharist was true. So I did a lot of research on that. And I don't have time to get into it now because that's a whole different 1 hour long talk on the Eucharist. But for those of you who get an email from me after these sessions where you've got a link to the video for tonight, I'm going to include a link to that talk, Considering the Eucharist. So if you're interested, you can check that out. It's a separate talk called Considering the Eucharist. You can check it out. Or if you're watching this video at home, you can go down into the description and I'll have the link there. If you have any questions at all about the Eucharist, if you've got any doubts at all about the Eucharist, please watch the video. I beg of you, watch the video. I go through all sorts of different things to explain where it comes from in the Bible, not just the manna, but in other places as well. Anyway, so moving on. We go to Mount Sinai. Once they arrive at Mount Sinai, God offers to enter into a covenant with the Israelites. And what he does is he says, if you obey me completely and keep my covenant, you will be my treasured possession among all peoples. You will be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And that's in Exodus chapter 19, verse 5 and 6. Then, through Moses, he gives them the terms of the covenant. This is the Ten Commandments. This is the law that the people must agree to follow in order to enter into covenant. The people immediately agree, and they enter into a covenant with God. In fact, they more than just agree to follow the law. They're ecstatic to follow the law. They're eager to follow the law. Why? Because they want to form a supremely intimate relationship with God. And this is the way to do it, through covenant. So in a similar way, when we're about to get married, we know we're about to accept certain modifications to our behavior in order to get married. We can't stay out all night. Guys, we have to leave the toilet seat. You got to put the toilet seat back down. We got to pick up our clothes off the ground and actually put them in the hamper. There's certain behavioral modifications we've got to do in order to warrant getting into that covenant relationship. But we are so in love and we so want that covenant relationship that we're pleased as punch to do that. And that's how they look at the law, which is how we should look at the law as well. They want to be in that covenant relationship, the covenant that creates a permanent family bond between husband and wife, in our case, or between God and his people, in their case. Following the Ten Commandments is the price of being in a covenant relationship with God. And that's why they genuinely love the Ten Commandments and the law. And it's why we should too. Just because they love the law, by the way, doesn't mean they can follow it very well. They're still very spiritually immature. They're like toddlers. And they get into trouble, but I'm getting ahead of myself, so I won't do that. Now, that takes us up through chapter 24 in Exodus. In chapters 25 through 31, 7 chapters, Moses goes back up to the mountain, and God describes to Moses the details of a pattern of worship. God spends 7 chapters describing how he wants to be worshipped. He only spent 1 giving him the 10 Commandments, which is incredibly central to everything. We all know that. He spent 7 chapters describing how he wants to be worshipped. This includes things like rituals, the ordination of priests and how that's going to happen, the structure of the tabernacle, the altar, how it's constructed, certain other pieces of sacred furniture, the incense, the sacrifice, all sorts of things, including the Ark of the Covenant, which will contain, amongst other things, the manna, the bread, In our day, it would be the Eucharist and the tabernacle. So one thing to note is during these 7 chapters, in chapter 28, God tells Moses that Aaron and his son, Aaron is Moses' brother, Aaron and his sons will be the priests. Now, God goes into minute detail about their vestments, their clothing, how they're to be made so that they can be clothed properly as priests, the process for ordaining them as priests, and their specific duties as priests. Things like sacrifices, incense, interceding for the people, etc. Now, does this contradict God's earlier comment that's still on the screen, where it says, you will be to me a kingdom of priests? Does this seem to contradict this? You will be a kingdom of priests. Aaron and his sons will be the priests. Seems like a contradiction. It's not a contradiction. The term kingdom of priests is a collective term. It's a collective calling. God wants the nation as a whole to be holy and to demonstrate to the world their close relationship with God. That's sort of the broadcast out to the world, what it means to be in close relationship with God. That's why God gave them the 10 Commandments, so that they could learn how to become holy. That's why it says, you'll be to me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. I gave you the 10 Commandments so that you could learn how to do that, so you could portray that to the world, and so that you could be set apart, right? Holy means set apart, or set apart means holy, both ways. So they're set apart from the average. They're distinct. They're differentiated. They're recognizable. We sometimes think of the 10 Commandments as limitations, but they're designed to help them and us today to grow in holiness, to grow in virtue. Now, by the way, I had to put this down. I have a separate talk on the 10 Commandments as well. It's about an hour long as well. And I don't have time to go into all the 10 Commandments, but it's really interesting because the early church taught the 10 Commandments not as thou shalt not, limitation, limitation, limitation. The early church taught the 10 Commandments as a way to grow in virtue. And so it's a completely different a way to look at the 10 Commandments, which are part of being in covenant relationship with God. So, in that same email where I'll put the Eucharist talk, I'll also put the 10 Commandment talk. If you're interested, go ahead and take a look at it. And if you're watching online, it's down in the description. Anyway, moving on. So this collective calling for the nation of Israel is what the Catechism of the Catholic Church calls the universal priesthood of the nation of Israel. In contrast, Aaron and his sons are a ministerial priesthood. They're ministers. They're specially ordained, and they're entrusted with specific liturgical duties. Only Aaron and his sons, only the priests, can perform sacrifices, manage the temple, intercede for people, and do those kinds of very special priestly duties. Today, in the same way, we are part of the universal priesthood, the priesthood of all believers, right? But we also have a ministerial priesthood. When we show up at Mass, we can't all just go up there. There's a priest that goes up there. This is what it is. Again, God has explicitly told Moses how he wants to be worshipped. Worship should be liturgical in nature, meaning it has a formal structure. It's rooted in sacred ritual, and it's led by a priest, someone who is specifically ordained to do that. The Catholic Mass comes directly out of this, plus what is later revealed and instituted by Christ. By the way, informal gatherings are fine. They're great. They serve a purpose. They're wonderful. Things like Bible study, things like praise and worship services, prayer services, things like that. All of those things are wonderful. But none of those fulfill what God's explicit description is of what it means to worship God. They're ancillary. They're add-ons. Okay? And they're great. They're wonderful. I'm glad you guys are here, for instance. But this doesn't replace worshiping God. That's what the Mass is for. Now, and this must be important because God spends 7 chapters describing this to Moses. Now, Moses, because he spends 7 chapters describing it, Moses is up on the mountain for quite some time, and the people get a little restless. Moses is gone for 40 days, and the people get impatient. And while they're waiting, well, actually, they don't. They stop waiting, and they say, everybody, give me your gold, give me your gold, give me your gold. They melt it down, and they create the golden calf. This is one of the Egyptian gods that they're very familiar with. And they're impatient, and they decide to go back to their roots, so to speak. This is going to come up time and time again. And they actually even start dancing around saying, this is what brought us out of Egypt. They completely forgot about the pillar of fire. They completely forgot about the Red Sea. Now they're saying this. Again, spiritual toddlers at this point. Now, while Moses is still up on the mountain talking with God, God, of course, knows what's happening at the bottom of the mountain. And God tells Moses, let me tell you what your people are doing, what your people are doing. And God says to Moses, go away. My wrath is burning. Just go away. I'm ready to destroy these people, and I'm going to start again with you. I like you. I'm going to start again with you. Now, we've seen this already, right? We're going to start again with Noah. We're going to start again with Noah and Abraham. And now he's about to start again. And God and Moses start talking back and forth. And God says, your people that you brought out of Egypt. And Moses comes back just a couple of verses later. No, your people that you brought out of Egypt. I mean, it's literally back and forth. Nobody wants to take credit for these people. And God repeatedly calls them a stiff-necked people. Have you ever heard that term? A stiff-necked people? And it just sort of said, well, I guess they're stubborn. Does anybody here work with animals, large animals like horses and stuff like that? Anybody who worked with large animals would know what stiff-necked means. Has anybody in here ridden a horse? You know, on a dude ranch or something like that. And what happens if you've got a stubborn horse? Can you move their neck? They're stiff-necked. You can't guide them. God's saying these are stiff-necked people. He says it repeatedly. Ultimately, though, Moses pleads with God, and he says, you made a covenant with these people. You made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God calms down and agrees to reestablish the covenant. Now, this brings up a little side thing for me, because I started thinking about this. Because thinking about the fact that, well, Moses changed God's mind. Well, God knew all along what was going to happen, right? So imagine that, let's just go through this for a thought experiment for a moment. We're off scripture for a second, just thinking for a second. Let's say that at 9 o'clock is when God said, I want to start over with you. I like you. And then Moses, for the next couple of minutes, is pleading with him. No, you created a covenant. You did all these promises. Stick with them, etc. And then about 9:05, God says, okay, I agree. I'll reestablish the covenant with them. Now, but if God knows the future, then he knew at 9 o'clock what he was going to say at 9:05. So why did he say that at 9 o'clock? Why didn't he just move forward to that? Well, because if he had just moved forward and said, okay, I'll reestablish the covenant, then Moses would never have interceded for the people. That would never have taken place, and that needed to take place. The intercession for the people is useful, and it teaches us something. That's why there's a benefit to this conversation that takes place, even though God knew what was going to happen in advance. God knows that this conversation will be part of the story that is taught to the children. It's part of the cultural heritage of the people that gets embedded in their hearts. It's part of what they need to know in order to understand how to relate to God. And it conveys 4 very special things. It conveys that what they did was wrong. They almost lost their relationship with God over it. But the intercessory prayer works. That God listens and he's merciful. All 4 of those things are taught in just a couple of sentences. And if God knew the outcome ahead of time and sort of skipped past that, those lessons wouldn't be part of the cultural heritage. So he had to, even though he knew it ahead of time, he had to do that. For one thing, to get those lessons into the cultural heritage, but also to prompt Moses to do the intercessory prayer, because our intercessory prayer actually does create benefit. Now, by the way, I skipped over last week. I skipped over what I happen to enjoy as a certain dialogue between Abraham and God. Remember last week, Abraham? There was a point in time, remember we skipped over the whole Sodom and Gomorrah thing? I said, we're going to skip over that. I'm now going to go back and I'm going to mention one conversation that took place between God and Abraham, because it mirrors this. There was a point in time where Abraham knew that God wanted to destroy Sodom. And Abraham is speaking with God and he says, listen, what if there's 50 good people in that town? I know you think they're all terrible, but what if there's 50 good people in the town? Will you spare the town for the sake of those 50 good people? And God says, yes, for the sake of those 50 people, I'll spare the town. And then Abraham pushes it. He says, well, what if there's 5 less than that? What if there's only 45 good people in the town? Will you spare the town if there's only 45 good people? Yes, I'll spare the town. This goes on for a while. He then gets down to 40, he goes down to 30, goes down to 20, goes down to 10. He finally stops at 10. So he gets down to the point, he's haggling with God. He gets down to the point where he's saying, God, if there are 10 good people in the town of Sodom, will you spare the city and not destroy it? And God says, yes, I'll do that. So again, the same lessons apply. This is going to be part of the cultural heritage. So that same conversation goes, what they're doing is wrong. It's going to cost them everything. But intercessory prayer worked. God listened. And he said, yes, I will spare the town if there's 10 good people. So those same 4 lessons take place. The problem is there weren't any good people in Sodom. So Sodom was destroyed. But the conversation still conveys the fact that he listens and that he shows mercy. But then there were no good people in Sodom, and it was destroyed. And if he had skipped that, there'd be no lesson. Let's say God already knows, and he already does know, that there's no good people in Sodom. So Abraham says, if there are 50 good people, and God just says, there aren't. End of lesson. There's nothing to learn from that, right? It just sounds like God is cold-hearted and he doesn't listen. So by having that exchange, even though he knows the end of the story, it teaches the people what's going on. Incidentally, the fact that there were no good people in Sodom, none, is a very important fact to remember. The land of Canaan, as I mentioned last week, is full of people who are wicked to the core. We'll get to that in a little bit. Now, through both of these examples, God is telling us that intercessory prayer is useful, that he does listen. In fact, it's one of the highest forms of love. God loves it when you intercede on behalf of someone else. It's a great form of love. It's very selfless, and you're asking for his help on behalf of someone else. He loves it. It pleases God immensely, so intercede for people. He loves it. Now, at this point, they've been at base camp in Mount Sinai for a year, and they're ready to break camp and start heading north into the Promised Land. And God tells Moses, listen, he tells Moses, he says, listen, you guys go on ahead. I'll send an angel to be with you, but if I go with you, I'm likely to kill you guys. So I'm not going to, read it, it's hilarious. So he says, listen, just go ahead. I shouldn't do this. And Moses comes back again and intercedes. And he says, if you don't go, we don't go. We won't be distinct. What will make us unique among the nations? The fact that you're with us is what makes us distinct. And again, God agrees, showing that intercessory prayer works, and he goes with them. Note, what makes us distinct as Catholics is that God is with us in the Mass. Jesus shows up in person in the Mass. That's what makes us distinct. There's parallels in here like crazy. For the rest of the book of Exodus, for the last 6 chapters, chapters 35 through 40, they build the tabernacle and all of the accoutrement, the Ark of the Covenant and the mercy seat and the lampstands and all the rest of the stuff. For 6 chapters, they're building all of this stuff. And this is 6 more chapters of the details of worship. And that's how Exodus ends. The tabernacle, by the way, sort of looks like this. It's out in the desert. It's kind of portable. They can pull it all together and carry it with them, and in the next place they can set it up again. This is the tabernacle in the wilderness, and there's all sorts of different things that are happening inside the tabernacle. There's some stuff outside, and then right in the corner there is the Ark of the Covenant, but that's just a picture. Anyway, so now we move on to the book of Numbers. There's no big 400 gap between this. It just sort of flows right into it. In chapter 3, God assigns the tribe of Levi, the Levites. He assigns them to Aaron and his sons, the priests. He assigns the Levites to Aaron and his sons, who remain the priests, but the Levites help out the priests. So they're kind of like deacons, although I shouldn't really use that phrase because it's not used, but it's kind of like that. They are not priests. The Levites are not priests. Only Aaron's line are priests. So only Aaron's line could offer sacrifices, enter the holy place, and do the core priestly duties. As a matter of fact, God said that anyone else who approaches the sanctuary will be killed. It's very serious about worship. Luckily, that doesn't happen at Mass. Then, in chapter 6, we read about the Aaronic blessing. Not ironic blessing, but the Aaronic blessing from Aaron. So, the Aaronic blessing. We know this blessing, but it's interesting how it comes about. God tells Moses to tell the priests the following. He says, "This is how you shall bless the Israelites. Say to them, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord let his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord look upon you kindly and give you peace. So shall they invoke my name upon the Israelites, and I will bless them." This is what he tells the priests to do. Invoke my blessing, and I'll bless them. He's saying this to the priests. Now, so God says that when a priest invokes this blessing, God himself will follow through, and as it says at the very end, I will bless them. So God's promising to follow through on this. If you and I had a conversation, and in all goodwill, I said to you, "The Lord bless you and keep you," well, that would only be an intercession on my part. It would be a request of God. It wouldn't be guaranteed to be granted at all. Now, hopefully he would, but there's no guarantee at all. If we look at a father blessing his child, that raises it quite a bit, because a father has a spiritual responsibility at home, but he's not a priest, but he does have spiritual responsibility at home. So God's far more likely to hear and to agree with that. But it's still an intercession. It's still a request of God. But when a priest does it, God promises he will bestow the blessing on the person that the priest has just blessed. Priests are special. The blessings of God are mediated by priests. The priests have that power. Not the nation, not the priesthood of all believers, just the priests. It's very important to understand that. So, moving on a couple of chapters, we get to a place called Kadesh Barnea, which is right at the southern edge of the promised land. So they've made it all the way up to just underneath the promised land, and they sort of stop, and they select one man from each of the 12 tribes of Israel, and they send them up as spies into the promised land to see, can we take this place? Can we take it? So they're up there to scout out the land. And they all come back, and 10 of them, they're all reporting to Moses and the people, and 10 of them come back saying that the land is fantastic. It's flowing with milk and honey. It's wonderful, but the inhabitants are terrifying. They're enormous. They're giants. They would destroy us. We'd never be able to take that place. 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, say that with God's help, yeah, we can take the place. Let's go today. Let's go. It's a fantastic place. And yes, we can take it. With God's help, we can go. We can do this. Then the 10 interrupted and spoke again, and again said, no, the people are terrible. We look like grasshoppers compared to these people. We'd never be able to do this. The Israelites, who are overhearing this, show absolutely no faith. They start quaking in their boots. They start murmuring, and they even start talking about rebelling against Moses and going back to Egypt. So God is saying that I'll lead you into the promised land. I will be with you and help you. And they say, we want to go back to Egypt. We want to go back to slavery. Not very good. So the result of not trusting God, God says, you're going to wander in the desert for 40 years. For every day that you spent up scouting the land, they were up there for 40 days. For every day you spent up there, you're going to spend a year wandering the desert. So that this generation, everybody above the age of 20, you're going to die out, and only the new generation will go in. Maybe they'll trust me, right? What's the big story of all of the Old Testament, all of the Bible? God is saying, will you trust me? Now, thus far, we're going to move on to Numbers chapter 21 here. And thus far, I have spared you detailing the constant barrage of complaints that are coming from the Israelites, just constantly. But there's one that I happen to like, and it dovetails in very well. So I'm going to share this one with you. It happens in Numbers chapter 21, verse 5. And it says this. It says, and the people spoke against God and against Moses. And they say this, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? For there is no food and no water, and we loathe this worthless food. The manna that God is providing for them, they loathe this worthless food. They despise the manna. For this utter ingratitude, God sends fiery serpents among the people. And when they get bit, many of them die. People change their tune real fast, and they come running to Moses and say, we have sinned, we have sinned. Go to God and ask him to remove the serpents. Notice they don't apologize. They just say, tell him to remove the serpents. God and Moses have a conversation, and God instructs Moses to craft a serpent out of bronze. This is the brazen serpent. Craft a serpent out of bronze and then raise it up on a pole so that everybody can see this bronze serpent. And if anyone gets bit, they can look at the bronze serpent and they'll live. This will save their life. Now, this is another type. This is another prefigurement, another hint as to what's going to happen in the New Testament. The resolution of this, the fulfillment of this is Christ on the cross. This is what the fulfillment of the brazen serpent is. And Jesus says so in the Gospel of John, chapter 3. We're very familiar with John 3:16, right? John chapter 3, verse 16. We all know this phrase, right? For God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that everyone who believes in him might not perish, but shall have eternal life. We know this one. But not all of us know the two verses that come right before this. That's sort of the lead-in to one of the most powerful verses in the entire Bible, perhaps the most powerful verse. The two verses that lead into it are these. John chapter 3, verse 14 and 15 says, and this is Jesus speaking, says, and just as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up, that whoever believes in him may have eternal life. And then it goes on to John 3:16. So that's the lead-in. It's the resolution of what we're learning in the Old Testament. It allows the people in the New Testament times to understand immediately what they see, because they're so used to it. It's ingrained in them what the brazen serpent meant. They know this as part of their cultural heritage. So it makes sense instantly when they see Jesus lifted up, because this is what's happening. Or at least they can make sense of it later when they connect it all together. Now, as they get close to the promised land, and just before that, Moses dies. But just before Moses dies, he gives a speech. And he warns the people, amongst other things, he warns the people that in order to survive in Canaan, there's two things you've got to do. It's like 2 bullet points. This is it. In order to survive in the promised land, in order to survive amongst those wicked people, you need to remember that there's only one God. There's only one God. Don't get lured away by the false gods. And teach the children. Teach your children the faith, because we can lose it all in one generation. That's true today. If we don't teach the children, we lose everything. We lose our entire faith in a single generation. So what was true back then is also true now. Now, Moses dies before they enter the promised land, and leadership is handed off to Joshua. Joshua was introduced back in the book of Numbers that we just finished. And God himself told Moses to appoint Joshua as his successor because of his spirit, because of his courage. And Joshua is going to lead the Israelites in 2 main ways. First, he's going to lead as a military leader. He's going to lead them in the conquest of Canaan, including the Battle of Jericho, which is the first one. And he's also going to lead them as a spiritual leader. He's going to renew the covenant several times throughout the book of Joshua, which is what we're just about to enter. So we're now in the book of Joshua. And with regard to the conquest of Canaan, God has promised to help them take the land. In one example, and I love this one, God says that I will send terror into the army that you're about to attack. I'll send terror right into their hearts. I will send hornets after them to drive them away. You'll be chasing after them, right? That's a great ally to have. Somebody who can put terror right into people's hearts and have the hornets chase. It's wonderful. It's like mini drones with stingers. It's great. But there's also a very difficult topic to deal with when we talk about taking the promised land. And it's one of the most difficult parts of the entire Bible. And this is a concept called haram warfare. God has determined that the Canaanites are utterly wicked, completely beyond redemption. And he tells the Israelites to completely wipe them out. You're not taking prisoners. You're going to completely wipe everyone out. Now, this bothers a lot of people, and it should bother a lot of people. God takes no pleasure in killing even the wicked. And like I said, it's one of the hardest things to deal with in the entire Bible. But Canaanites practice some absolutely tremendous evils. They are evil at their core. They practice child sacrifice. They've got one of their gods is Moloch, and there's a statue of him holding a plate full of burning coals, and parents would come in with their infants and place their infants on the burning coals to offer them to Moloch. These are wicked, wicked people. And God has decided that it's simply too dangerous for the Israelites to live side by side with these people. So he says, you've got to utterly wipe them out. Now, some of the people just cut and run, so they escaped. But if they're not going to run, you got to wipe them out. You can't live alongside such evil. The evil has to be destroyed. Now, it's a tough teaching, and it's another example of how God teaches us through events. One of the ways I look at it that's not quite as dastardly and violent as Haram warfare is that each one of us is imperfect. We fail, and God will forgive that. But if we examine ourselves and we find any part of ourselves that is wicked, we should want to utterly destroy that part. We should utterly want to get rid of that. And that would be sort of like a Haram warfare. We don't want to just live side by. We don't want to be okay with having that dwell within us. We'd want to get rid of that utterly. So, like I say, it's a tough teaching. But ultimately, with help from God, they take the land. And the military campaign heads north, heads south, and it takes the entire land. And then, but by the way, despite the instruction from God to utterly wipe out the enemy, they don't. The Israelites end up living side by side with these people. This is going to come back to bite them next week. It's going to cause big problems later. Now, but they do control the land. And what they do is they now divide up the land into 12 parts, and they do a tribal allotment. So each of the 12 tribes get one allotment. But if you look at it, you don't see each of the 12 tribes represented. Right? If you remember the list of Jacob's sons, you wouldn't see each one of them there. Because first of all, Joseph stayed down in Egypt. So Joseph isn't on there. So now we're down to 11. And the Levites, the assistants to the priests, they don't get a tribal allotment. I'll explain in a second. So they're down to 10. But Joseph's two sons, the half-tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim, they each get an allotment. So now you're back up to 12. So you do have 12, but two of the people have swapped out. Now I mentioned the Levites. The Levites don't get a region. What they get is 48 individual cities spread throughout where they can teach from. So the Levites become the priestly assistants and the teachers. And they're spread out around the Promised Land. Now, do you remember the... hold on. Oh, Joshua. Did I... Wait. There's something missing. Yep. There's something missing. Sorry, there's a slide that's supposed to be up there. Remember the nice, pretty picture with Abraham and the three promises underneath? That's what's supposed to be on the screen. Do you remember the three promises that were given to Abraham? Land, a kingdom, and worldwide blessing, right? At this point, that first one is realized. They've taken the land. So the promised land is now theirs. That first one has taken place. But in order to keep it, they need to remain God's people and not be lured away by false gods. So in the last chapter of the book of Joshua, shortly before Joshua dies, Joshua makes a speech, similar to the way Moses made a speech to try and teach the people at the very end. So Joshua tries to encourage the people to be faithful to the one true God. Why does Joshua feel this is so important? Well, Joshua went through the wilderness with them. He's seen the people worshiping false gods throughout the wilderness. So, and now he knows that they're going to be living amongst people who are worshiping false gods. He sees this as a recipe for disaster. So he's seen them fall into temptation, and he sees the temptation on the horizon. He doesn't want the pattern to repeat. So Joshua gathers all the people together, all the elders, all the people, and he reminds them of God's faithfulness. He reminds them of all the miracles in the wilderness, in taking the land of Canaan. He reminds them of the assistance in battle, the hornets and stuff, and all sorts of different things. And then he tells them to cast out the false gods that your ancestors served in Egypt and out in the wilderness. Cast them aside. And he continues in Joshua chapter 24, he says, if it does not please you to serve the Lord, decide today whom you will serve. As for me and my household, we will serve the Lord. And the people respond to this, and they rededicate themselves to the covenant. Yes, we will serve the Lord. But then soon, once again, they're worshiping false gods. We'll get into this next week. And they're committing idolatry, and it happens again and again and again. There's a cycle. Now, you may think that this kind of thing only happens in Old Testament times. Idolatry only happens back then, but that's not true. Back then, they melted down gold and they created, calves out of gold. And then they bowed down and worshiped it. But we have idols today. We live amongst people who worship false idols. An idol is anything that steals so much of your attention that it diminishes your relationship with God. If anything steals so much of your attention that you diminish your relationship with God voluntarily, that's an idol. So we don't melt down gold and create calves anymore, but we spend an extraordinary amount of time on our phones. We worship the almighty dollar. We do all sorts of things. And any oversized pursuit of money or power or pleasure or comfort or status can turn into an idol. And I say an oversized pursuit because in moderation, providing for your family or doing that kind of stuff, that's fine. That's what you should do. But an oversized pursuit of that, where it becomes greed, where it turns you away from what God wants you to do, that's an idol. So we shouldn't just think that idols are only Old Testament kind of stuff. We have to be worried about it here. We need to recognize that we live among things that could turn into idols. We need to be careful, we need to be vigilant, and we need to be faithful. Now, next week, we're going to explore what happened once they possessed the land. What happens then? What goes right? What goes wrong? And do they get that royal dynasty? That's going to be the kingdom that we're going to talk about next week. Thanks for listening. God bless you. God bless our country. And God bless the church all throughout the world.